All right, well, let's kick it off, guys. Hey, welcome, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Matt Sanregret. I'm Vice President of Sales here at Payroll Systems, and just want to, again, say thanks for joining us. Today's webinar is about properly navigating financial compliance in the cannabis industry. For those on the line who are involved in the cannabis industry, you know what a daunting task financial compliance is. And we want to kind of clarify and give you some tips for how to navigate that, how to move forward. Just a few things on the webinar. Everybody's muted, but we do want to encourage questions. Please familiarize yourself with the chat feature in the webinar software. Please send I guess it's questions or chat. Please send us a question. We can decide if we want to address that right away, or we can address that at the end of the webinar. We will be leaving some time at the end for questions. I have attached the slides we're using today as a handout, so feel free to grab those. And also a question we get a lot on these is this session going to be recorded? Can I share it with others? And the answer is yes. We are recording the session. Should have it posted generally by the end of today or sometime tomorrow morning. We'll have things posted, and you will get an announcement with a link to where you can go view the webinar. All right, let's kick it off. So first of all, for those of you not familiar with Payroll Systems, we offer a full suite of payroll and HR services backed by great technology. We've been serving businesses throughout the U.S. for the past 30 years. We are based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we've been offering a transparent and fully compliant payroll service to the cannabis industry since 2018. Before that, like most payroll folks, we had to turn away that business or turn a blind eye if they were utilizing a management company or some sort of DBA. And we decided to investigate a little bit further. We wanted to find out if there was truly a way we could offer a compliant payroll package to the cannabis industry. And after a good amount of research, we found some partners in the industry. We researched proper financial compliance. We basically did a lot of things that other payroll companies have chosen not to do. And back in 2018, we did come out with a full service payroll offering. Okay. And what that means is basically once we establish an account, once we do some due diligence and establish an account with a cannabis company, there's no fear of getting terminated on those services due to the industry that you're in. Okay. So once again, thank you so much. We will have full contact information at the end, and we'll have a chance for question and answers as well. For now, I'd like to kick off. I have some great experts in the industry on the line that I'd like to introduce to you, and we'll kick off the webinar. Okay. So first up, I'm going to have Dave Bass. Dave's an attorney whose career has spanned both trial and transaction work, high compliance and high-profile cases. Recently, he joined the KNCH law firm, where he counsels and defends medium and small businesses. So thanks, Dave. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
We also have Carol McCormick. Carol serves as the Chief Compliance Officer for North Bay Credit Union. She manages the cannabis banking program, which provides banking services for over 100 cannabis operators. Carol brings over 30 years experience in the areas of risk, compliance, and operations. And since joining North Bay Credit Union, she's built a team of compliance professionals dedicated to providing the best banking services to the cannabis industry. Okay. And I also have Ariana Von Alstein with us today. Ariana's Vice President of Legal and Regulatory Affairs at the Connected Cannabis Company. She oversees the company's legal, compliance, and regulatory affairs. Prior to joining Connected, Ariana developed and managed a cannabis practice at a law firm where she represented a wide range of cannabis businesses and advocated for their cannabis licensing and compliance needs. So again, as you can see, you have a great team. Really appreciate everybody being here, and we're ready to kick it off.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
All right, so David, I'm gonna jump to you first, and again, I'll kind of play master of ceremonies here. I'll also be managing the questions. So if you see me looking away, that would be because questions are coming in. So David, I'm going to have you kick off. I'd like to just talk about what's new in the industry, et cetera. But I'll talk about the agenda first. Our agenda is very, very straightforward. We definitely want to talk about the latest financial updates, what's going on 2020, how is COVID-19 affecting this industry. And then it's pretty simple from there. We're going to just get into what does actually financial compliance mean? Why is it important? And more specifically, how do I get there? What are the steps? What are the concrete steps I need to take to achieve financial compliance being in the cannabis industry? And again, we'll reserve several minutes at the end to go through specific Q&A. We can also follow up, continue the conversation later. I'll be providing all contact information, both for payroll systems as well as our guests today. All right. With that, David, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about latest updates.
All right. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. So first of all, I think it's not lost on anybody in the industry that most people have been able to open, whether it's a dispensary or continue operations because you've been deemed essential by your state. But obviously, under the federal rules, we still have the Controlled Substances Act, and that's really what animates the entire discussion of what we're talking about today. Because of the Controlled Substances Act, it puts the states in a very difficult position, and then by federal law, it puts banks and financial institutions into a difficult position, and we'll talk more about that a little later. Speaking of financial institutions, here we have the Safe Banking Act, which is likely on hold until 2021. Now, there has been some movement, obviously, with the COVID packages that have been going through the House. The most recent one was passed, and it did have the language for the Safe Banking Act. Yesterday, 34 attorney generals on both sides of the aisle, both Republican and Democrat, sent a letter asking for this to be passed. They largely held this on three points. One is obviously public safety, getting cash off the streets. The second is it's just easier to collect taxes. But I found the third one really interesting. Basically, cash is dirty, and it transmits, of all things, the virus. So that is why the Safe Banking Act is in the package. The critics of it being put in the package say it's just a wish list of the Democrats, and I think that that's a little unfair. I think that this is a bipartisan issue. It's going to come up against a little bit of difficulty in the Senate. However, Mitch McConnell comes from a hemp state. He's now a hemp guy. I believe that he sees cannabis as a competitor to hemp, so he's going to take a lot of cajoling, and the Senate definitely has a lot more obstacles in place for the Safe Banking Act. So it might be a little while before we see that getting pushed. Recent legislation for COVID-19, unfortunately, there's been no movement in allowing cannabis companies to participate in any of those programs. The SBA has taken the same tact as the bankruptcy courts, as the IRS, in holding that the CSA is prohibiting them from being able to go down that route, whether it's medical or recreational. Regardless, they're basically saying that nothing, the PPP loan, the payroll protection, family first recovery, all of that is off the table. This final point that I just wanted to bring up is not so much an update as much as a point that the cannabis industry doesn't really hear a lot, and that is that there are other industries that are facing these same issues or face similar issues, and I don't think it's much of a consolation, but it's good to know that there are groups out there that have dealt with a lot of these troubles. When it comes to applications and the difficulties of getting a license, I could just say that casinos and gaming industry, their applications are actually a lot worse. And I only bring that up to say that the only way to get through it is this compliance issue, this financial compliance, and this this concern of best practices. And if you stick to that, if you stick to making sure that everything in your applications and everything in your books are squared away, you'll find things going a lot easier. As for banking, not to say that it's a 1-to-1 ratio or by analogy, but like adult online entertainment, again, another vice industry, very difficult to bank that, and they lose their bank accounts quite a bit because of, for example, chargebacks, which is a thing that happens quite a bit on credit card transactions. So a lot of these vice industries go through the same things, and what I've seen in those other high-risk industries that I assist financial institutions in banking, what they experience is the ones that are more squared away and the ones that have more of a dedication to compliance will find themselves maintaining their bank accounts, finding investors, being able to move their businesses along to a more profitable path. So that's it for that slide.
Thanks, David. All right, next we're going to move on to the topic of what exactly. So we wanted, financial compliance, due diligence, et cetera, et cetera. What exactly does this mean? What does this mean to your business? So, Carol, I'm going to turn this one over to you. Talk about specifically what financial compliance means to a business in the cannabis industry.
Thanks, Matt. So at North Bay Credit Union, we've been banking cannabis for about 2.5 years. And as Matt said in the intro, we're actually about 125 accounts now, and that's everyone from, kind of what we consider tier 1 plant touching to ancillary accounts who derive income from serving cannabis, but that's not their main source of income. And so we've created a program and a platform to hopefully provide the best in kind of normal banking services to the cannabis industry, which has not always been available. And, some of the things we've done lately because of the lockdown, because of COVID-19, is, we dispersed our compliance team to work from home to be safe. And so we enabled a lot of online capabilities for our cannabis businesses. So things like, being able to take pictures of checks for remote deposit, being able to pay using bill pay for some of their vendors. And a lot of those kind of things that you might just, in a normal business, if you will, a non-cannabis business, take for granted, are now available. And I think a lot of operators don't realize that, as we have continued to improve the technical options that are out there, it's passed through to our cannabis operators. And so, David made the point earlier about cash, and the truth is there's lots of different payment options out there to have cashless payment systems. We work with lots of alternatives to cash, and we're all about keeping everybody safe, right? The main reason that North Bay got into banking cannabis was really to make our community safer in Sonoma County. We now do serve accounts all over California. So we do pick up cash directly from our operators and take it directly to the Federal Reserve. So there is no safety issue with people with bags of cash walking into our branches. And we've worked a lot with Matt and his team on setting up payroll for our cannabis operators. So for the, instead of having to pay employees in cash, which is a safety issue, with direct deposit, easy to do. So really we can help businesses, cannabis operators, regardless of the kind of license they hold, to have a transparent banking account. Every week I get phone calls from 1 or 2 people who say, can you help us? We've had our account closed down. And usually those are accounts at banks that don't want to bank knowingly cannabis. So, yeah, you can get away with it for a while, but every single financial institution has software running in the background, looking for cash deposits, looking for out of pattern activities. And that's how these banks find out what business you're in. So, you can save some money for a little while, but ultimately they will catch you And you're way better just to work with a financial institution that is banking cannabis knowingly, doing it compliantly, and partnering with you to make sure that you're doing it compliantly. And that's really, that's the best advice I can give you.
Personal experience with that financial institutions who are not willingly working with cannabis businesses are looking for licenses. The week that the first few weeks that the BCC was issuing provisional licenses, I think I had, when I was external, I had 7 clients who all had their accounts shut down within a 2-week span, and we're trying to figure out what happened, and the provisional licenses were the link between them. So confirming from the industry side that happens regularly, and I'm sure the folks on the call who are in the industry are probably nodding their heads because they've all had their bank accounts shut down at some point.
Well, and it's interesting, Ariana, because even last week I got a phone call from a packaging company, right? Had been in business for 30 years and literally provided packaging to one cannabis account. And their bank is shutting them down. I mean, they have all this other business that has nothing to do with cannabis, but as soon as they saw that, they're shutting down. And, you know, for an operator that's been in business for 30 years and has had a long-term relationship with the bank, for that to happen doesn't feel great, and created a lot of anxiety and concern for just running their business, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it happens across the board.
Right on. Thanks, Carol. I actually have a poll question I'm going to pop up here. Speaking of banking, so what we want to do is put a question on the screen, give a few seconds for everybody to respond to it, and then we'll move on to our next topic. Go ahead and choose one of those options regarding your banking. Fantastic. All right. Close that down. And Carol, I also had another question come in talking specifically about banking. So this is a little different process, I'm assuming, than walking down to Wells Fargo, having your driver's license, and walking out with a book of temporary checks. What type of time frame are we talking to establish a cannabis compliant bank account?
So, you know, everybody that I talk to asks me that question, and really the truthful answer is we work on the applications in the order we get them. And so if our application is online, we've made it as simple as possible, but the kinds of things we ask for, we need to know obviously who the owners of the company are, right? So you'll hear that as beneficial ownership. We have to know 100% who owns these entities. We need to know their corporate structure. Are they a partnership, an LLC, a sole proprietor? So we get the corporate documents that support that. We ask for, you know, just an overview of the kind of business they are. Now, our system is automated. We check cannabis licenses immediately through the onboarding, so they don't have to provide that information. We've continued, I mean, we do ask for a lot of information. It is not like walking in, but we've tried to streamline it and make it only necessary. We obviously care about financial projections and if they file tax returns and that kind of thing. For the financial institutions, this is all about making sure that funds coming into the credit union or into the bank are funds from legal cannabis sales, right? It's all about anti-money laundering. And so for us, it's knowing our customer. I mean, under the kind of the regulations for banking in general about knowing your customer, you know, North Bay, I'll just speak, and I think it's true for any other cannabis banks, we just, you know, we want to partner with clean, compliant operators who understand why we're asking the questions we're asking, and, you know, and once they're onboarded, then, as I said before, it's pretty typical banking at that point.
Fantastic. All right. Let's move on to our next topic, which is, so we kind of defined what this is all about. Now it's why. Why is this important? So, David, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about why. You know, why is this important? Why should I care? I've been operating. I have my management company. I have a bank account with Wells Fargo. I mean, we've talked about, you know, possibly getting your services terminated, but you know, I can play that game a little bit. But why else should I think about trying to take these steps and get financially compliant?
Sure. So I think this dovetails well into what Carol was just saying when we're talking about FinCEN. Now, everything that we're just about to talk about, you see that main bullet point about the the feds, let's just call them the feds in general. Enforcement efforts aren't going away. They're changing. It's not like the old days where it was all, busting into a dispensary and things like that. Those days are gone. Now it's evolved, whether it's the U.S. Attorney's Office, the IRS, or other agencies. FinCEN, for everyone, is the Financial Center for Enforcement, Financial Crime Enforcement Network, sorry. And they create rules for banks and financial institutions to follow. So when Carol was speaking about the beneficial ownership rule, well, FinCEN just came out with a new beneficial ownership rule that basically told banks they have to drill down to a heartbeat with these, LLCs and corps, whatever it is. The bank has to know who the beneficial owners are, and the higher the risk of the industry, the more they need to know their customer. It's called KYC, know your customer. So right when the Cole memo came out, I'm pretty sure everyone probably here is familiar with it. FinCEN came out with its own memo that was designed to encourage financial institutions to bank the industry. And it really didn't have that effect. In fact, most of the financial institutions that are doing it now are really sticking their necks out, like Carol and her team, to kind of lead the way and show how this can be done. So there are obviously financial institutions throughout the country that are doing this now, but they're taking their main guidelines from FinCEN and creating programs that are going to be able to meet FinCEN and obviously the insuring regulators, for example, the NCUA for credit unions. But FinCEN is looking primarily to make sure that these financial institutions are filing the correct what are called SARs, suspicious activity reports, and those aren't necessarily going to attract anyone's attention because so many of them are being filed now. But when you do have a bank account canceled, they're likely going to file a termination SAR. So this is why not having your name out there, getting terminated left and right, and just going to a cannabis compliant bank, then you at least know that you're following the rules and your name isn't tied to any of these termination SARs. The next bullet point there, 280E tax is still very much in effect. The IRS has become a little bit more aggressive on their litigation strategy and taking a lot of interest in taking these appeals to the IRS tax court. So there's been last year and then coming up in this year, I think you're going to see a lot more opinions coming out. None have been very beneficial to the industry. We're going to talk about one, I think, on another slide, but it's important to know that if you're going to be getting 280E information from a CPA, I would not suggest taking too aggressive of a stance. Also, to remember that a lot of these opinions that are coming out, they were initially, these are like 2012 cases, 2013 cases. So the industry has changed a bit. There's a bit of a lag time before they get to the appeals, so you can only read so much into it. But what's interesting is, for example, a case that I'll bring up later is the industry was putting in all these management companies as kind of a stopgap to be able to get around 280E, and a recent case basically said, we don't care how you create your structure, if you're trafficking, you're trafficking. So just remember, 280E is still being aggressively enforced. The weed map subpoena, that's an interesting development out of the Eastern District here in Sacramento. The U.S. attorney had used the grand jury to issue subpoenas to weed maps. The span of this kind of net that was thrown out there with the subpoenas is pretty broad. And looking for
that's an understatement.
What's that?
Pretty broad is an understatement.
Yeah.
Like
But I
all
can tell you,
records of everybody you've ever worked with in the history of your business and all of
right.
their records and everybody that they've ever met.
So, and a lot of it was targeting things like political contributions as well. What they're looking at is whether or not, Weed Maps was pushing illicit sales, primarily like a lot in the LA area. They're looking at those enforcement priorities. That's what they're concerned with, and especially, with the FBI, their top priority is public corruption and this industry, which has gone. I mean, there is and does exist a lot of political corruption when it comes to the cannabis industry, and it hasn't been caught too much. So I think they're really going for those enforcement priorities. They're not going after state legal. But what I would say is it's very difficult, I think, to know what's state legal and what's not state legal when you don't have a strict compliance structure. And so the worry I would have if I'm running my operation fast and loose is the false positive that comes up. Yeah, you might be state legal, but if you've got all these other issues going on, especially if your books are bad, well, it's not very hard for the FBI to pick up the phone and call the IRS. So if one agency is looking at you and they might not think that you're there for, good for something criminal, they could very well push it off for something civil. And that's where the financial compliance and just a compliance culture is important. And the final part, track and trace is a forensic tool. I think that this is going to be utilized a lot more, using track and trace to go back, see how your records are being held, and see, one, if you got two tracks, right, using the track and trace phrase. If you've got a track of illegal sales and a track of legal sales, or if there's something that you're not tracking at all. If you look at what happened in Las Vegas, there was a tax audit done, and they couldn't even really get the audit off the ground because the track and trace information that was being put in was garbage. So it was garbage in, garbage out, and they couldn't tell how much in taxes they weren't getting. And I can tell you that, especially in this time period where we're seeing tax revenue plummet, I think there's going to be an increased pressure to find those taxes somewhere else. And anybody that's on this call knows the cannabis industry is, is on the table, on the menu. And I think the states and the local jurisdictions are going to be looking to, hey, are we getting shorted, and using track and trace as a forensic tool to find that out.
And keep in mind that Metric, the state contracted track and trace program, allows users to complete functions within Metric that are not compliant with regulations. Metric is not the regulatory agency, or any of the regulatory agencies, I should say. So Metric sometimes allows you gives you the rope to hang yourself as a cannabis business. So you can't rely, I would not rely, I would highly recommend that businesses don't rely exclusively on Metric for what they can and cannot do. Always be looking to those regulations, because it may not be an issue now, but when the BCC comes in a year, 2 years, 5 years, or the IRS comes in and is looking at your books, and you have, things R&D'd out where they should not be R&D'd, and it's, significant product over a significant period of time, that could be a source not only for tax enforcement, but also for licensing enforcement or loss.
And I would just, I would make a point. It's getting caught by the regulatory agencies is one thing, but I'd put on everyone's radar that, especially back in the day when I'm a former prosecutor, so I'm just speaking from experience. Back in the day, you relied on informants. And I can tell you that California actually is about to probably pass a change to their False Claims Act, allowing tax to be something that you can, a whistleblower can come in and say, this company is not giving up, X amount of taxes, $5,000, $500,000, and they're going to get a cut. And I bring that up just to say that it's not always whether you're going to get past the regulators. You could have somebody that then you terminate, or maybe not terminate, but they leave. And if they knew that the books are getting moved around without that, like again, that compliance culture, you could be facing it from somebody from the inside. So just one more reason to not even try or give anyone else the ability to do that. And that means incorporating controls within your own organization that makes it so that somebody perhaps doesn't fudge the books for your benefit or for their own.
Right. Let's talk about another reason, and that is how I want to grow my business. And a popular tool that folks need to help grow their business is to get investors, to get capital. So let's talk about that topic of exactly what financial compliance means to attracting investors.
Right. And so, I mean, it's not lost on anyone that no one's lending, right? No one's really lending to cannabis. So investment, relying on investors is huge. The ability to do that, I think that we're really seeing it slow down in terms of people just handing out money to anybody in the cannabis industry. The belt has tightened, and so I think it's important you're able to present a complete set of books, and you're able to present to any investor showing how serious you are about keeping all of your books straight. That means just requiring proper financial documentation, your basics, hiring a CPA that specializes in this area, and doesn't get cute with the books, because I'm pretty sure you can find either a good CPA or somebody who's probably a little less diligent. Imagine what it's like from an investor's perspective to see bad books or books that are just really sloppy. The thought, especially with so much litigation happening right now with investors going after people saying, hey, they walked off with $2.5 million. I see it all the time on my Law 360 blog. Of another investor suing somebody. So as those stories come out more and more, people are getting a little tighter in terms of what they're expecting, and they will walk away. There are companies out there, I mean, I do due diligence, but there's companies out there that are specializing in due diligence, and they'll be able to see bad books or cooked books fairly quickly. So it's important that now that we're getting a little more sophisticated in our understanding, using even track and trace to decide whether somebody's credit worthy or not. The due diligence is just getting more sophisticated. Originally, when maybe a couple years ago, a lot of people were pretending to know what they were talking about. Now people are actually picking up on what is a normalized type of a business. How much should this business be making versus the one down the street? Another issue that has come up is the Canadian Stock Exchange. It is still a little bit too easy to get on the CSE. The Canadian Stock Exchange last year, and looking back other years, had an audit done on. They have to look at the books of anybody on the Canadian Stock Exchange, and 100% of those companies had auditing and accounting irregularities. No one was compliant in how they were reporting the type of profit they were making, how they were making it. And that has now created a lot more pressure, both on the Canadian Stock Exchange as well as the companies that are coming in with that money into the American market. So I think it's important, if you want to get bought out by one of these companies, there's going to be a lot more forensic work being done. To be honest, I've read some of the stuff that came out of the Canadian Stock Exchange. I think there was a lot of embarrassment for some of these companies, and very few of them have profited the way that everyone thought they were going to. So a lot of money's been lost because of bad books. And what does that mean? Litigation. So there's a ton of litigation right now coming out, going after these companies that didn't get their books straight. And then, of course, everyone's going to be looking at 280E and seeing if you've been compliant the whole time, how you run your business, and whether or not you took an aggressive 280E stance, how you maybe have decided, oh, well, we sell a lot of non-cannabis products, so we're going to, you know, take that out of cost of goods sold, when in fact you didn't have very many or have very much of that. Just how creative you got with 280E is going to potentially you know, be a black mark. So it's important to just be a little bit more conservative on the 280E aspect of your business.
I think we have another 280 topic here on this next slide as well. And maybe you can give just a quick high-level summary, you know, in a quick fashion, David, on the 280E. I think most folks are going to be familiar with it, but maybe they just know it more at a very high level here. So what's your take, and what do you think these folks need to know about 280 that they don't already know?
Well, what they should know is that the IRS has taken a stance that all 280E allows you to take for a deduction. Well, to cut out of your bottom line is the cost of goods sold. That's it. There is no way around interpreting 280E to allow you to take any other deductions, no matter whether or not you create a management company that you then push a ton of your costs into, you know, with an S Corp. And I think this goes to this on this slide. There's a case, Alternative Healthcare Advocates via the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, and they basically looked at a management company and a dispensary and said, they're both 280E. It doesn't matter how you make it. So if you have this management company where you're putting all your employees, it doesn't matter. And they treated them both the same and taxed them under 280E. 280E just allows you cost of goods sold. Now, this case here, NCSBA v. IRS, it was actually a really well-written complaint or a real well-written opinion on both sides, but the dissent was probably the best one that I've seen out there that explained kind of how future arguments might be made. But the case itself held that, one, there's no penalty. 280E is not a penalty, so it's not an excessive fine under the 8th Amendment. There's really no limit to the amount of deductions. All deductions are prohibited. And then also, you know, even if you're state compliant, you're still trafficking under the CSA. The dissent made a couple of really good arguments about how it can't be considered income, because technically under 280E, you could be penalized all the way to the point where you don't make any income, potentially. And although that's not happening, obviously people are making profit, 280E is still, should, I think, under the dissent, be seen as a penalty. At the very least, it's a penalty. And so but it ultimately comes down to, until the cannabis is taken out of the CSA, the Controlled Substance Act, the IRS is going to be fairly aggressive in enforcing this. And when I say nothing has changed yet, it just means that, like the dissent, there's a growing acceptance, I think, amongst the judiciary that something has to be done. But always with the majority opinion, what they've been saying is that's Congress's job. And I think that, you know, the bankruptcy courts have been saying the same thing. Moving on, successfully tackling audits. You know, some of these cases that have gone up to the courts, the audits have given the dispensary sometimes the benefit of the doubt on some of the issues. So they might have initially an outstanding balance of $300,000, and then by the time it gets up to the appeals court, it's $100,000. And I think that's in part because there was records, there were information to be handed over to the IRS. I think the days of holding 2 sets of books, the reason you used to do that is because if the DEA came knocking, you would bust out the side of books that said you didn't do much business, and then you had another set of books in case somebody wanted to buy your business. Well, those days are gone. I think you just have one set, but the set has to be good. And so you got to make sure that you're staying up to par, because when the IRS does come, or now the state tax agencies, like we said, they're going to be looking for taxes. They're going to want to see that that they're collecting their due or getting their due, and they're going to be able to see it from multiple places, not just you at the dispensary or cultivation. They're looking throughout the entire supply chain to see how the money they can collect is being collected properly. I think the next spot, ensure that you're properly insured. I think that's just obvious. Again, I'm a litigation attorney, so I see litigation everywhere, and liability everywhere. Products liability is a big topic now, so you want to make sure that you're insured. Again, with strict products liability, it's everyone in the supply chain that sold something. So make sure that you're insured to cover any of your liabilities. And if you've got a board, maybe look into errors and omissions and officer insurance. Finally, employee retention. And I think even, Matt, you might be able to talk to this as well, but, a lot of employees are worried about safety. Ariana and I both have seen clients get, robbed, or, and Carol knows, there was a death a couple of years ago right down the street from North Bay. And it was, somebody that shouldn't have been hurt. And, reducing cash is extremely important. I take that seriously from my time in law enforcement. It's a hazard. So protect your employees, get a bank account. I think that it's a benefit, it's a safety issue. And I think that once employees feel safe in your business, they're not going to go and take whatever you've just trained them and go to another business where they would feel safer. So.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, David. I actually have another poll question I'm going to launch real quick, and then we'll get into the step-by-step and nuts and bolts of actually how I get compliant. So this has to do with a topic we talked about, the investors. Quick yes or no, and then we'll move on to the last segment of the webinar today. A few of them coming in. Also, this ensures people are actually paying attention out there, so take a minute. Perfect. All right, thank you. We'll close this down. And Ariana, I'm going to move on to you for our grand finale here.
Excellent. All right.
And this is going to be talking about how, so take it away.
Yeah, this is where I spend my time and live my life. And I know that it touches every part of the business. So, and I've worked with every size and every type of business in cannabis, and Connected is vertically integrated. So we get all the problems from all of the different angles. So if you look at regulations, if you look at the BCC regulations, the CDFA regulations, the CDPH regulations, each one of them has a section, and I encourage everybody to go and look at those sections, which require record keeping for every part of a cannabis business. So, and I wrote them down in case anybody wants to jot them down. For BCC, it's section 5037. For CDFA, it's 8400, and for CDPH, it's 40500. And you can see in those sections that BCC alone, so as a requirement just to operate your business day to day, it requires that you're keeping all your bank statements, your receipts, your tax records, your CDTFA records, your training records, your personnel records, your contracts with other cannabis businesses, your permits, your security, your waste destruction records, your metric records, and your documents, with all of your documents with your employees. So it's extensive, and the regulatory agencies haven't been focusing on that as of yet within audits, or I should say, haven't been robustly giving penalties to cannabis businesses, but that will likely be coming. So through and through, for purposes of just for your compliance to maintain an operable business is a requirement, aside from the other reasons for your tax audit purposes and to be able to acquire a bank account. And this goes through every part of the company. So it is a function of, should be a function of compliance, but it should also be a function of your finance department and a function of your operations department and a function of every single part of the business, because if each of those segments or areas or just however you are coordinating your org chart, but if all of those departments aren't talking to each other, then you're not going to have accurate records. So consistently going back and saying, okay, well, this is how finance is recording this, but is this actually how this operates? Is this actually how this transaction is taking place? And on the flip side, on the operations side, when you're looking at what you're doing as a business and how you're conducting your business, checking that back against your compliance department, against the financial department, in terms of making sure that you're conducting business in a way that you can represent and make sense when it comes time to do your financial reporting, which is, really regularly in cannabis, and for some local jurisdictions it may be monthly instead of quarterly, and definitely yearly. So having a system to put that all together is really important, not only for working with the bank, for getting a bank account, but also for day-to-day maintenance. And the more that a business is working on tracking their financials and their taxes the right way, the better they're going to be in a position, and the better they're going to look when it comes time to apply for a bank account or reach out to an investor, and it makes the entire process easier. But it's not for most businesses, because they haven't been operating on a large scale and aren't used to the type of financial reporting and the type of record keeping that's required by the local, state, federal agencies. It's a process. So I would start there with those processes, with those internal SOPs, looking at your org chart, looking at your ownership structure, starting from the very basics, from those beneficial ownerships. Are our owners who we think they are? Is that reflected accurately in our LLC documentation, in our corporate documentation, in our representations to the regulatory agencies? Because as you're backing all these things up, as you're backing all this documentation up to each other, if there's a break in that link, it's going to be problematic, not only for the record keeping, but when it comes time for an audit, which cannabis businesses are subject to audits more frequently than other types of businesses are. So making sure that you're tracking that, going back to the simplest thing as the ownership structure and as the financial interest holder structure. If you're paying attention to the regs, you're probably aware that anybody who holds who receives a portion of the proceeds of commercial cannabis business is a financial interest holder in that business and needs to be reported accordingly to the regulatory agencies. So tracking that in and of itself can be a complicated venture, especially if you're a couple of years out and had some family office fund or some small investment 2 years ago, and you have to go and track down those individuals' driver's license numbers so that you can report that the right way. It's difficult to go back and do that kind of internal forensic accounting, and it's important to have the right people on your team that understand not only the accounting or the CFO role or the CPA role, but understand that specifically for cannabis, and or are partnering with people who do and have the patience to work on it and learn and get up to speed on the specifics in cannabis, because like everything else, cannabis is a little bit like with everything else for a cannabis business. All of those pieces are a little bit different, and it takes it takes paying more attention than for some other business types, because of all of the nuance of the local, state, federal laws and the interaction between them. And The going back really quickly, I'm not going to belabor this point too much, but going back quickly to what David was mentioning about the management companies and the layered entities, most cannabis businesses that I've worked with do have those layered entities. So having all the details, not only for the licensed entity, but for all of the layers that a business has, and understanding the roles that they have with one another and being careful to represent that in a way. And if you don't have documentation, appropriately acquiring that documentation to be able to then backtrack and say, okay, this is how this was done. This was why this was done. If we made a mistake, is this something we can go back and fix? And how do we do that so that when we do get audited, because it is a when and not an if, that we're prepared for that and we can answer those questions and we appear that we know what we're doing, because we do know the internal what's going on with our business. Proper and current licensing, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I mentioned the regulatory agencies, but that's really important, especially if you have multiple entities, multiple licenses, and paying attention to the renewals and the local tax structure on top of the state tax structures, to make sure that coordination and that positive relationship with the local governments continues to be positive, as is necessary to operate. And it makes a big difference. All of the small individual issues that a cannabis business has in the record keeping process, they may not be an individual issue that is large in and of itself. If you say, okay, well, we made a mistake on this and we made a mistake on this, but if the regulatory agency or the tax authority is coming in and they say, it's a no mistakes on the first page thing. If you see no mistakes on the first page, you're like, okay, this business knows what they're doing. They have it together. If they say, okay, this is one mistake. Oh, there's 3 mistakes on the first page. Maybe we want to look a little bit deeper into this company and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. And then at that point, it opens the company up for larger liability because you're having a more in-depth audit because you didn't have those ducks in a row at the outset. And that goes.
David nodding his head over there.
Yeah.
It's the same thing for on the criminal side too. The minute you start seeing something suspicious, everything is suspicious.
Right. If I'm an auditor, I mean, if I'm in my external role as an attorney, in my internal role, if I'm looking at something and I see a bunch of mistakes, I'm not only going to do a deeper dive, but now I'm annoyed that I have to go in through and correct these mistakes. It's always people that are reviewing these documents or conducting an audit, right? So, as everything else, it's relationship based, and if your errors create a negative first impression, then it tends to go deeper than that. So in part of in the record keeping process, I have create an employee training program. That's really important because to create redundancies so that it's not just one person who's housing all of your financial information or one person who knows how to correctly prepare tax documentation, because if that person leaves, then you're stuck not knowing what's happening with your company. So creating those SOPs and having transparency upwards and downwards in your chain of command helps a company be able to process and continue functioning appropriately, regardless of if a person leaves. And depending on their level, that makes a bigger wave or a smaller wave anyway. But I've seen that, I've seen that with companies large and small, where a person leaves and they're the only one with a particular type of institutional knowledge, and all of a sudden, because they didn't have it written down, because they didn't have their records kept and SOPs on how something was done at the company, they're then left in a poor position for that person leaving. And then I think it touched on proper entity structures. So we'll
move on. I think we're actually coming up on our hour pretty quickly. Ariana, I had a couple of requests here to repeat the agency sections again.
Yes.
So we had people frantically trying to get out their notepads on that.
So
we'll move on to the last slide. Go ahead.
these aren't the only sections, but they're the the primary sections on record keeping. So for the BCC, it's 5037, which is Title 16 California Code of Regulations, Section 5037. Sorry, I am so intimately familiar with the Code of Regulations that I sometimes forget to give a little bit of background. I am a person, not a robot. I apologize. And for CDPH, it's 17 California Code of Regulations, Section 40500. And then for CDFA or Cal Cannabis, it's Title 3, Division 8, Section 8400. And like I said, those are not the only sections, but those are the sections that require that have the primary requirements for record keeping. But you'll see references to record keeping throughout the regulations, which does bring me to the last slide, the first point on the last slide, which is that those state regulations are not going to be your only record keeping requirements. Likely, whatever local jurisdiction you're operating in has record keeping requirements in their local ordinance or in your development agreement or both. So go back through and see what you committed to as a cannabis business when you signed all that paperwork and affidavits and your firstborn child away to the local government to get your license, and guarantee that part of that is going to be your record keeping requirements for your financial records at the very least, and probably other records on top of it. I know for Sacramento, where I am, the record keeping requirement is a paper record requirement, which is obviously an antiquated ordinance. The original Sacramento ordinance was created in like 2010 or 2011, and really should not have been a hard copy record keeping requirement anyhow. But much like the COA paper requirement, it's there. So for now, it has to be done that way. Or, if you want to make the calculated decision to have electronic records, that's business decision to make. I understand, save trees.
We did have computers back in 2010, didn't we?
Right.
Way back then.
Law school would have been much more difficult without them. So, and on that point, working with, for the record keeping, working with your professionals, and I mentioned in the last slide as well, and coordinating amongst each other. So even though you may have a independent relationship with your CPA and your attorney, and for various reasons you may want to keep those separate, in particular privilege issues, but there are certain things that you will want to coordinate amongst the professionals that you're working with, to make sure that you're on the same page, that information is being represented consistently throughout the organization, and that you're getting that advice in a meaningful way to do the maintenance. And I know this is kind of a played metaphor, but it's a difference between putting oil in your car and spending that money to make sure that it runs properly, or not, and waiting till the engine blows up so that and having to buy a whole new car, right? Or having to start from scratch, or having your license pulled, or having the federal, the IRS come after you. Same with expending that money or that effort with your external resources or your internal resources if you have them, to make sure that you're coordinating amongst the different departments that touch these records and that should be keeping them. And it's not just a matter of scrambling to get the records to talk to Carol and acquire a bank account, or to talk to Matt and get payroll services, but it's so that you have that on a regular basis and are prepared for the audit, for the investment, for your internal audits that you may be required to do based on your corporate paperwork, and then again SOPs for maintaining those records. And there's one other reason that we haven't talked about, but is such a crucial piece for the cannabis industry right now, with the immense tax burden at the federal level and the really heavy burden at the local level and the burden at the state level. One of the conversations that I frequently and recurrently have with regulators and lobbyists and trade associations is that there is a lack of data on the impact of taxes on the cannabis businesses in a meaningful way, and how the regulators are desperate for real information on how businesses operate and how far, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Laffer curve, but how far to the right we are of that, which is like a basic economic concept that you want to maximize the government revenue by having an optimal tax rate that allows businesses to function, but allows the state to take in money. But right now it's so burdensome that businesses are not being able to operate. So if you have those good records and we can gather information and the industry can gather information as an industry, far more effective to go to the regulators and say, this is the data, this is why we're making no money, this is why businesses are going out of businesses and can't get investment because it's so difficult to make it as a cannabis business. So for your own self-preservation as a business, but also for the industry as a whole to be able to continue to operate and effectively advocate on behalf of itself, those good record keeping methods will help with that. And I'll end on that point.
Right on. Hey, great stuff, Ariana. I was thinking also just what government wants to hear right now is people being employed. And if
Right.
you have a thriving, healthy business, you're also employing people, and they're paying their own individual taxes. So that's a nice story as well. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to Carol and David as well. I'm going to display the contact information here for just a couple minutes. We're basically ready to conclude. We've hit our hour, so I just want to say once again thank you to you two. If anybody has any parting comments, feel free to share right now, and we'll probably wrap this up in just another minute or two.
Just feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Same here. And thank you, Matt, for pulling this together.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
No problem. Thank you for taking your time.